You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
People called him the Quiet One, the heart and soul of the Beatles. Even though McCartney and Lennon, George Harrison enjoyed the attention while quietly making his own name in the band. But there was a deep-seated anger behind that calm exterior that not many people saw coming. So, who was George really mad at behind his back? Was it a band member who took all the attention, a boss who had power, or even someone you didn't expect? Today, we're going to show you the most complicated and maybe even the most surprising friendship in Beatles history. Because there's more to fame and music, there's a grudge that could change how we see the Fab Four for good. Hold on, as we find out the truth about the person George Harrison hated the most. It is well known that John Lennon and Paul McCartney competed with each other in writing songs, but rumors of another tense relationship have been going around for years. This time, the main point is on George Harrison and the one person he was said to have a very bad feeling about. How things work. Having too much power and artistic freedom in the band often caused problems, especially with Harrison, who wanted to be more creative and get credit for what he did. He was always overshadowed by David Byrne and John Lennon. But let's go back to the beginning before we do that. Early life. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, in Liverpool. Harold Hargreaves Harrison and Louise Harrison had 4 children. He was the youngest. Harold worked as a bus driver and had been a ship's steward before. Louise was Irish Catholic and worked as a shop helper. She was on the White Star Line. George had 3 siblings, a sister named Louise who was older than him, and 2 older brothers named Harold and Peter. Boyd, Harrison's historian, says that his mother Louise was very supportive of her. To the happiness of children, knowing that George's love of music brings him joy. Louise Harrison, who was George Harrison's mother, loved music very much, and was because of how loud her singing was, it could shake the windows in their house, to the surprise of people who came. She often listened to Radio India while she was pregnant with George because the sounds of the sitars and tablas were so beautiful. She hoped that this strange music would make her future child feel calm and at ease. An author who wrote a biography of Harrison said, "Every Sunday she tuned in to mystical sounds made by sitars and tablas, hoping that the strange music would bring them peace." There was peace for the baby in the belly. The Harrison family first lived at 12 Arnold Grove, a simple row house in Wavertree, Liverpool, where George lived for his first 4 years. The house didn't have any modern conveniences. It had an open toilet and a single coal fire for heat. The family moved to a public house at 25 Upton Green in Speke in 1949. George was 5 years old when he moved there. Enrolled in Dovedale Primary School. Later, he passed the 11th grade test and went to Liverpool Institute High School for Boys from 1954 to 1959. Even though the school had a music class, George was upset that there were no guitars, and he thought the classroom atmosphere was too stuffy. George Harrison's early musical inspirations were many and varied. His ideas came from singers like Hoagy Carmichael, George Formby, Cab Calloway, Django Reinhardt, and Cab Calloway. During his youth in the 1950s, he played with Carl Perkins and Lonnie Donegan. But it was during the early part of 1956, he was riding his bike when he heard Elvis Presley's singing. Heartbreak Hotel was playing from a house close, which got him interested in rock and roll. Harrison's was the best even when he was in school at Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. He clearly loved music because he would draw guitars in his schoolbooks and say, "I was totally into guitars." Slim Whitman was another important influence on him, whom he saw in a magazine or on TV, which made him even more interested in the instrument. Harisson became more interested in music when his friend Raymond Hughes offered to sell him a guitar when he was 14 years old. Louise paid £3.10 for it, which, taking inflation into account, would be about £110 in 2024. Harisson learned some important songs from a family friend, such as Whispering, Sweet Sue, and Dinah, which led him to become a musician. Harisson started his own skiffle band, after hearing Lonnie Donegan's music with the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend named Arthur Kelly. It was on the bus to school that he met Paul McCartney. That was the start of became friends and played music together for life, changing the course of music history. Early career. George Harrison tried out for John Lennon and Paul McCartney's skiffle group in March 1958. At Rory Storm's Morgue Skiffle Club with the Quarrymen. At first, Lennon thought Harrison, who was only 15 years old, was too young to join, but McCartney set up a second tryout on Harrison played the lead guitar part for Raunchy on a bus in Liverpool, which pleased Lennon. This made Harrison hang out with the group and finally became a full member. Harrison quit school at age 16 and became an apprentice electrician at Blacklers, even though his father wanted him to keep going to school. A nearby department shop. In 1960, when the Quarrymen made their first trip to Scotland, Harrison went by the name Carl Harrison, which came from the name of a singer, Carl Perkins. During this time, Harrison's trip with the Beatles began, and his guitar was used. Their musical skills and talents would be very important to the band's growth and success. In 1960, Alan Williams booked shows for the Beatles at Bruno Koschmider's clubs in Hamburg, called the Indra and the Kaiserkeller. This was their first stay in Hamburg, where they started to improve their songs in the lively club scene. But their time there was cut short when George Harrison was deported because he wasn't old enough to properly work in nightclubs. By December 1961, Brian Epstein was their boss, and he worked to improve their public image. EMI eventually signed them to a recording deal, and their first single, they put out, Love Me Do, which got to number 17 on the record retailer chart. The next year, Please Please Me, their first record, shot them to fame during the height of Beatlemania around the world. George Harrison got the nickname because he was known for being serious and focused on stage. As soon as the Beatles came to the United States, they were known as the Quiet Beatle in the beginning of 1964, when Harrison was very sick with strep throat and a fever. Urged him to hold back his voice until their show on The Ed Sullivan Show, where the Beatles made their historic TV debut, which made them even more famous around the world. During the Beatles' trips, George Harrison's reputation as the Quiet Beatle became stronger, where his quiet personality stood out against his more talkative friends. This nickname, made up by the press, made Harrison laugh, and stuck around throughout his career. Harrison's impact on the Beatles' music started to show. He had 2 children. Lead vocals on the Beatles' first record, which had the hit song, Do You Want to Know a Secret? This song was written by Lennon and McCartney. By their second record, Harrison had 3 major vocal roles in With the Beatles, 1963. Harrison was an important part of the Beatles because he found new American hits, like Don't Bother Me, which was his first song written by himself. He became more interested in music, especially soul music. By the time of Rubber Soul, 1965, he led the band toward folk rock sounds that were influenced by the Byrds and Bob Dylan. He also started to play around with Indian traditional music. Harrison said later that Rubber Soul was his favorite Beatles record. He played the sitar on Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown. The 1966 album, Revolver, showed how good Harisson was getting as a musician and an innovator. In the band, he wrote songs like Love You and Taxman, which were the first tracks on the record. I Want to Tell You, and Too, which has Indian instruments like the sitar and tabla. Harrison's tambura part in Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows showed how the Beatles were exploring new sounds of non-Western sounds and instruments, which helped them discover new music. When George Harrison learned about Indian music and faith, it changed the direction of his music career with the Beatles. His use of the sitar on Norwegian Wood is a great example of this. David Reck, an ethnomusicologist, said that Harrison's work showed respect for Asian culture in popular music. By the time of Revolver, in 1966, Harrison's effect was clear. Added songs like Love You Too, which made him famous as the Maharaja of Ragarok. As in Strawberry Fields Forever, he was still interested in non-Western instruments, where he played the swarmandal. By 1967, Sergeant Jack Black's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Harrison's interest in spirituality was clear in the song Within You Without You, which has sitar and tambura in it. He chose to show Eastern teachers on the cover of his album shows how his study of Eastern ideas grew. Harrison felt different ways about Sgt. Pepper, calling it a big deal and in the music business. His experience with Indian music not only shaped his work with the Beatles, but it also had a long effect on Western music. Eastern musical styles are becoming more accepted in popular society. In January 1968, George Harrison recorded The Inner Light at EMI's Bombay studio with local musicians, Indian artists, putting out his first Beatles single with a Hindu-themed song and meditation. Later that year, when the Beatles were making their Rough White album, tensions reached their highest point in the group, and Ringo Starr briefly quit. Harrison's efforts included Eric Clapton's While My Guitar Gently Weeps and the happy Savoy Truffle. By late 1968, Harrison was influenced by Bob Dylan and the band's approach to making music with a group, while he was at Woodstock. This made him want artistic freedom, which was at odds with Lennon and McCartney being in charge of the Beatles. Tensions rose during the Let It Be was shooting at Twickenham Studios in the beginning of 1969, which made Harrison quit the band on January 10, unhappy with the studio setting and the way people interacted with each other. Harrison reunion with the group. George Harrison came back to the band 12 days after leaving for a short time in January 1969. When the Beatles agreed to move their movie project to Apple Studio and stop working on it, Paul McCartney's plan to appear in public again. Even though things have gotten better, tensions stayed high while they were making their 1969 album Abbey Road. Two of Harrison's contributions to Abbey Road were called Classics by music expert Lavazzoli, Here Comes the Sun, and Harrison finally reached the same level of fame as Lennon and McCartney as a songwriter with these songs, especially Something. Something stood out because it was his first A-side, which came out on a double album. It was on an A-side single with Come Together. The song was number 1 in Canada, Australia, New Zealand and West Germany. In the US, both sides of the song went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. George Harrison's song, Something, was sung by Frank Sinatra in the 1970s. 2 times, in 1970 and 1979, and called it the best love song in 50 years. And John Lennon thought it was the best song on Abbey Road. Something became another hit. It's one of the Beatles' songs that has been performed the most, right after Yesterday. Harrison got his second number 1 hit in May 1970, when the U.S. version of Together with McCartney's The Long and Winding Road for You blew #1 on the Hot 100. By this point, Harrison had a lot of fans. Collection of unreleased songs that show how productive he has become. Even though Harrison improved as a musician, his anger grew within the Beatles because of limited appearance on their albums, usually only putting on 2 or 3 songs. Not being happy with things was a big reason why the band eventually broke up. The last time Harrison recorded with the Beatles was on January 4, 1970, when he, McCartney and Starr added extra tracks to Let It Be for the record with the same name. One thing that was true about all of the band's records was that they had both good and bad times. Control in the band often affected how they interacted with each other and sometimes led to this caused problems, and George Harrison developed a strong dislike for one of his band members. George and McCarthy's fight. For most of their work, the Beatles were very close to each other. Relationships within the group. Hunter Davies says they didn't live in a commune. They lived separate lives but shared them together. They were best friends. Pattie Boyd, who used to be married to George Harrison, talked about how close the Beatles were. She said that they all belonged to each other. She admitted that some parts of their she and other husbands could never fully understand or get into the relationship. Ringo Starr also talked about how close the Beatles were to each other. He remembered how they looked together, looked out for each other, laughed a lot, and treasured the time they spent together. Starr wrote about these times, even in small places like hotel bathrooms, as being full of love and care, which showed how close the four of them really were. Both George Harrison and Paul McCartney were important members of the Beatles, and their friendship was complicated and changed a lot over the years. The four met during their time in the band. Harrison and McCartney were the first to meet. They met as kids on a school bus and quickly became close because they both loved music. They learned and practiced new guitar chords together a lot, which was the start of their McCartney has called Harrison his baby, and they worked together on songs with the Beatles. Brother, implying a close family connection that went beyond their work together on music. Even though they were friends, Harrison and McCartney sometimes had problems with each other, especially as the Beatles changed over the years. Making of the groundbreaking record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 was a turning point. The record, which is widely considered a masterpiece, was mostly driven by the creative vision of Paul McCartney. During this time, McCartney became more influential. Play in deciding the band's direction, which sometimes made Harrison's efforts seem less important. Before 1969, Harrison had a hard time getting the same attention as John Lennon and Paul McCartney as a musician and the driving force behind the Beatles' creativity. Lyrics were often given less attention than those of Lennon and McCartney, who were the main songwriters for the group. Harrison was unhappy with this mismatch. Who wanted more creative freedom over his music? By the time Abbey Road was recorded in 1969, things were getting tense between Harrison and his bandmates. Harrison and McCartney had a fight. Harrison spoke out more strongly, rejecting McCartney's ideas for changes to his songs. This was a big change where Harrison started to assert himself. His creative freedom and demand that the band recognize his artistic accomplishments. An interesting talk was recorded by author Anthony Fawcett and written about in Barry Miles' biography, Paul McCartney, Many Years From Now, 1998. Paul McCartney and George Harrison's dynamic within the Beatles is shown. McCartney, who is known for being honest, he admitted that his songwriting skills had changed from Harrison's. He told John Lennon, "Well, the thing is, I think that until now, until this year, we've written better songs than George." His songs are at least as good as ours this year. But Harrison's answer to McCartney's evaluation seemed to brush off the similarity. Harisson disagreed, saying that McCartney's idea of a sudden change wasn't always in line with the timeline of songwriting. He said, "That's a myth, since I wrote most of the songs this year last year or the year before. I don't know if I care anymore if you like them or not, I just do them." This conversation shows a greater conflict within the Beatles about recognizing creative work, and McCartney's recognition of Harrison's growth as a songwriter shows that he is reluctantly accepting of Harrison's rising status as an author in the band. Harisson, on the other hand, says that he writes for himself instead of looking for acceptance, shows that he wants to be free and express himself artistically. There was a lot of friction and creative disagreement between George Harrison and Paul McCartney when they were working together on music. According to Ashley Kahn's book, George Harrison on George Harrison, Interviews and Encounters, Harrison said that he liked other bands more than McCartney. "That's the truth, would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney," he said. With all due respect to Paul. Paul plays the bass well. But he's a bit too strong at several times. Anytime I could, I'd join a band with John Lennon, but never with Paul McCartney. McCartney, but it's not about them. Just from a musical point of view. Harrison admired McCartney's singing skills, but he thought McCartney's style was too much at times. This relationship was especially clear when McCartney was recording the song Maxwell's Silver Hammer in 1969.